Hey, this is your boy Miguel. Welcome to Common Conversations. These are conversations that we have on a day-to-day basis in our households and our workspaces, amongst our friends and our families, and sometimes even our enemies. And no topic is off the table. You can bring it up, you can be a part of it, or not be a part of it. And so welcome. And I have my beautiful co-host with me here.
Hi, friends.
I love it when she does hi, friends. That is such a new thing for me. It is awesome. Missy, thank you.
My name is Missy Smith, and I am so excited that you all are here. Your presence in this room is the culmination of a year's worth of work and just the kickoff to another year that we're going to be doing some real work.
For those of you, a little bit of history. So Common Conversations started in 2002 when a journalist friend from New York called me and said, hey, Miguel, we're having some disparity issues in New York about contracting and government spending, et cetera, et cetera. And I'm doing an investigative report. And she said, I'm in the process of starting a podcast so that we can discuss what we're finding openly. And I said, you're nuts. I'm not gonna do that. And I was like, what is a podcast? And so we sat down and realized that a podcast is nothing more than a radio show with your own channel dedicated to your own community. And so we built Common Conversations on Blog Talk Radio. And so we did that for about a year, and then we put it to sleep, and then we brought it back and did something on FM radio. And so every so often, we bring back Common Conversations, and it seems to be at the times of heightened discussion, right? When we are facing different things in our community, whether it's police brutality, whether it's equity issues, whether it's financial issues, but things that we need to discuss so that we can broaden our horizons, right? So we can learn more from each other. We all read, well, maybe not everybody, but most of us read. I'll say most of us probably even retain the things we read. But more often than not, very few of us sit down and talk about how we really feel in open spaces, right? We go to work and we have to be PC. And if you don't know me, if you haven't listened to the show, I do cuss. I'll try not to. But sometimes I say to hell with PC, because PC is the reason we got here, being politically correct, right? Because we're part of a politically corrupt system. That is how Common Conversations started, and it has been that way ever since. And then Missy called and said, hey, I got this idea about a year ago, right?
Yep.
And I'll let you take it.
So about a year ago, I became aware of some grants that would allow us to start these conversations on a bigger space. Miguel and I have had conversations about disparity, about equity amongst ourselves, but I really felt like I believe deeply in James Baldwin's quote that not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced. And because I believe that we have an opportunity to really make difference, but we have to have conversations first. And I couldn't think of anyone else in this world who is more equipped and more poised to do this work with me than Miguel. Number one, because he does tell the truth, and he is a truth teller, and that's really important to me. But also because he owns a production company, and so he can do all of these things and sit up here with me, which is wonderful. And all that to say that we are here and very thankful to be here with a grant from the Indiana Department of Health and the Office of Minority Health, because when they heard our idea, they agreed that Southern Indiana needs to start having these conversations. We'll talk a little bit more about that, about why specifically Southern Indiana is poised and I believe ready for this work. But also we want to thank New Hope Services that is represented by our exec team here today, and also F5 Productions for all of their nifty mechanical things that I don't understand.
It's just toys. They're just toys, things we get to play with, right? Some people literally play with toys. I go find things that move and click and have batteries and make them do other things. But so, these conversations are important in many ways. And so one of the things that we talked about as we thought about this process was everyone does traditional panel discussions. We all sit on panel discussions. We're all experts in our own spaces. But very rarely do we sit in a room and have an open dialogue or open conversation and have the ability to be vulnerable, to get it wrong, to say the wrong thing, to say the right thing, to address our opinion, to bring our own expertise into a space. And a lot of times, there's a lot of reasons folks don't do it, right? I tend to do it because I run toward chaos versus running away from it. I am not opposed to adversity, and I think we actually learn when we can face adversity and the chaos a little bit better, right? And when we're talking about change, and we're talking about racism, when we're talking about social equity, when we're talking about political equity, whatever that space is, right, we can't do anything different until we all have a voice in the room and are heard. But even more importantly about being heard, as Missy and I have had these conversations, we also have to realize that we have to be talking about the same thing. And sometimes we're using words that don't mean or are not being received from one person to the other. And therefore we get up from the table without clarity, thinking that we're clear. Right? And how can we really erect change? How can we really make the adjustments in our community if we're not on the same page and we're leaderships, we're heads of state, or we're just people with a podcast in our backyard, right? And so,
and I think that realization hit us really hard, that we've been talking for months about something and completely we're having two different conversations. And so I think that was what we realized. Our first panel and our first discussion needed to be, let's talk about equity. What does that even mean? And let's kick off so we all are using shared language and shared understanding to move forward together. Before we jump in, though, we want to talk about the space, and we want to define this space. Often when you walk into spaces like this, and when you're talking about social justice or equity, you hear safe space, that this is a safe space. I'm going to challenge that, and we're going to define the space differently. This space is not safe, it's brave. So, because safety is inherent. We are here to keep you safe, and you will be safe in this space. However, safe spaces are supportive, and they're not really a place where learning is, it's not inherent to learning. It is a place where everyone can be heard. Beautiful, lovely. A brave space is a space where we can disagree, but we're going to do so with respect. And it's okay. It's okay. One of the things that Miguel says to me all the time is, but what if everyone's right? We're just using different words. Or what if everyone's wrong? And then what does that mean? What do we do with that? But we're going to be brave. We're going to be brave with each other. We're going to have opportunity to speak with one another about some of the things we're talking about. But more than anything, I want us to be brave with ourselves. Some of the things that we're going to say, we're going to feel. We're going to feel in different parts of our bodies. It'll take our breath away, or we're just going to deeply disagree. And I want us to take note of that. You have note cards on your table for that purpose, to make note of what feels wrong. Or where do you feel something when we use a definition? Where are you feeling that? And does that make you uncomfortable? Does your inherent reaction, your quick reaction, make you uncomfortable? Because it's something that you should be agreeing with. Like, well, politically, like if I were on the side of social justice, I would agree with that. But what if you don't?
Yeah, right. What if you're a white supremacist and you're sitting in this room and you completely disagree with everything I have to say? Or maybe you're the gatekeeper to white supremacy. You don't see yourself as a racist. You see yourself as someone who does right by the community, but your community does not house black, brown, green, or yellow people. So your community is all white men, or all white women, or all LGBTQ, or all black. Or here's the even funny part. What if, so T and I, my wife right here, we've been doing these crazy fun discussions for a while now. And one night we got invited to New Albany to sit down with some yogis some years back when they were reading Michelle Alexander's book. And I'm not going to go into it because it's super long, but what we found in the conversation with these three white women, and they invited us on Facebook as the random black people to come sit and have a conversation where they felt they could say things and share things and get honest feedback that they had never done out loud. And as we were sitting there talking about culture, where they grew up, how they see things, one thing that came out in that conversation was how we identify black people and African American people. And had we not had that discussion, we would not have learned a thing, but they wouldn't have learned a thing either. And so as we do this, one lady said, well, we were brought up never to say black people because black people are bad. Black people are evil. Black people will rob you. But African American people are safe. And I sat there for a minute because I identify as black, not African American. And when I introduced myself as a black man in America. And at that moment, I realized the population that I live in may see me as a criminal, less than, unequal, by the nature of a word that starts with black. That's why we have these equity conversations, and that's why we have to get to definition. So as we begin this journey, and we're gonna have an open conversation, we also want you to chime in, right? Your feedback matters, because beyond this conversation is how do we actually do things differently, right? Some people will say, I would have rather just blow the whole system up and start over because you can't correct the machine that's already broken. But then other people will say, well, no, we can go and tinker with it and we'll finally get it right. But when we're built on the backs of slaves, you can't wake up tomorrow, nobody's giving that wealth back, right? Nobody's giving those policies back. But we'll get into that. That'll be our conversation. So
I was like, that's like 5 note cards.
Okay, I'm
later,
sorry.
So.
I'm gonna shut up now. See, this is the other part about having a conversation. I tell Missy, just tell me to shut up.
No, never. Literally never. One of the things I did mention is the state did deem this project worthy because we were able to identify that Southern Indiana is its own space. We are our own community. However, we rely deeply on the infrastructure and systems that are set up in Louisville. If you look at Louisville, you'll see that they have an infrastructure to have these conversations. They have organizations dedicated to nothing but. Now, are they getting it 100% right? Of course not. But they're making strides and they're having these conversations. We are not Louisville, and we need to start setting ourselves apart. Also, what we know as a service provider, so I work for a nonprofit, and we provide services to people who who often use public assistance, and that we can't rely on Louisville in that way because we can't cross state lines to get services for our families. So we have to make sure that those who can make a difference and who are the power brokers in the community realize Southern Indiana needs to provide equitable services on its own and stand on its own, because our people, our families, the children cannot cross that state line to get health care, cannot cross that state line to get public assistance or services. Our service providers in Louisville cannot help us in Southern Indiana. We have to be strong here and stand on our own. And the state agrees with us, so I'm very excited about that. Our project is built on the idea that in order to sleep at night, especially those who make policy, who are the power brokers in the area, they have to tell themselves certain stories. They have to believe certain things about the world around them. They have to believe that good things happen to good people. Or if bad things happen, there are services there to catch them. And those of us who do the work can name that is not the case. That this world doesn't operate equitably, and Southern Indiana is no different. And until we can name those inequities, we can't move forward. So that's what we're here to do. But again, all of that to say, we're going to talk a lot about equity. As we move forward in the year, we're going to talk about equity in specific systems. So our next talk will be about the child welfare system and what that looks like. We're going to talk about domestic violence. We're going to talk about mental health. We're going to have all of these discussions and be very specific to one system. But how can we even have these conversations if we don't describe what equity even is? I'm saying equity like 1,000 times, but what am I even talking about? So yeah, we're here to start the dialogue to see what Southern Indiana does with that. And I'm going to use another quote that Maya Angelou, I use this all the time in our program. So Healthy Families is a child abuse prevention program, and I'm the program manager for that program. And we believe deeply that people want to do the best that they can. That's an inherent belief that I have. I believe that once you equip people, then they will do better. And Maya Angelou told us that do the best you can until you know better. And then once you know better, then you do better. And that's what we're here to do. We're here to start that conversation so we can know better, know more, and then do better together as a community. But our ultimate hope is to move the needle toward equity. But what does that mean? So, Miguel, what does equity mean to you?
Nothing. No, I'm just playing. Let's do it this way. What does equity mean to me? So when Missy and I first started talking about what equity is, I totally disagreed with her.
He still does.
And I still marginally do, because when I'm talking equity, I'm talking about ownership. I'm talking about having access to the equivalent resources that one can thrive in any given society without obstruction, right? The other thing is, and we're going to pair all this. Y'all can read that if you want. I told Missy I'm not going to remember the slides today, and Zave's going to grace us by following this, and I love you, man. But I also think about the idea that in many ways, I think equality in this country is a tool of oppression, and that we often use it in reverse than what it should be done. But because we're all so trained and brainwashed by a colonial and an imperial education, that we sometimes can't see clear that we're actually doing reverse work. So for me, equity is about removing obstacles, all obstacles, not just social, not just political, but also economic, because countries are formed based on economics. They're not based on our love. They're based on how do we thrive this country in respect to how do we thrive off free labor, or something we call minimum wage. And we is not all of us. We is the few who has the power to actually control who has access and what access you get to. And so for me, that's what equity is and is not. And yes,
so I think one of the things also that you mentioned in that is equality. And equality is something that for years, that was our call, that was our cry to be equal. What equality ignores is that we don't all start from an equal playing field, that this country doesn't launch us all from the same space. And the graphic that Zave put up shows us that if you give everyone equal resources, then someone's still hurting. Because someone who didn't launch from the same place, who the playing field wasn't equal for them to begin with, you're only helping. And equality and equal resources typically only helps the power brokers. And when you act as if everyone starts from an equal space, and this is where Miguel and I can agree, equality is oppression. So in this graphic, and there are so many that you can find that can highlight that for you, equality is oppression for that person who doesn't have the ability to use the resource given to them. Equity is the act of leveling the playing field in seeing everyone as an individual and speaking into that need rather than giving everyone the exact same thing. Something that I say a lot in my parenting and a lot in my program is that fair is not equal and equal is not fair. And I believe that very, very deeply. There is an idea if you can't do for everyone, then you shouldn't do for anyone. I read a story of a school system that wanted to make sure everyone had computers. Well, as we know, if you just think about our school systems here, half of them did. Half the kids had access to computers and had access to the internet. Well, the school system said, we have to do the same thing for everyone. We have to be fair. So they gave everyone a computer. Well, now some kids had 2 computers, but the kids who didn't have one to begin with didn't have access to the internet. If they had allocated those resources effectively, they could have given access to the internet and computers just to those who needed it. That's equity. And we live in a space that more often than not, policies really lean towards the idea of equality rather than equity and rather than seeing people as individuals who have individual needs.
Don't disagree. Hey, Zay, throw that slide back up there with the people on the fence. Because I think about when people show this slide, and I remember Missy first brought it to me. And understand, when we have these conversations, we all have our own opinions. And some of us will step into the role of what we've been taught. And some of us are outliers. And we will take what we've been taught and say, it doesn't work for me, I'm gonna do something else, right? But I remember when I first saw this, and it was before Missy sent it to me, but I remember the first time I saw this and somebody was saying, hey, there's this fence and these three people and they need to see over the fence, and equality would be making sure that everybody could see over the fence. And I remember first thinking to myself was, no, that's not equality. Equality would have been thinking about them before you built the fence. Equality is asking who gets to build the fence. Equality is taking a very complex issue in this country and trying to simplify it in a way that there is a win for everyone. But we have to first understand the very reason we're building fences is because we're doing the opposite of equality, right? If we use that image, there's a game happening, right? They're playing soccer or they're playing baseball, and I love it when people show that. Because now what we're showing is that there's someone who probably owns that team. And what they didn't want was the outside people seeing for free. And that's why they built the fence. That was the intent, was to keep people out. Right? And I think we have these conversations within our institutions as elected officials or in our businesses. The policies that you govern your business by are often to keep people out. But yet we'll sit at the table and say we want equality. Now here's the other thing. Not everybody at the table believes the same thing, right? So if you're saying, hey, I want to create equality for black people, but you have racist people, or you have discriminatory people, or I love the word biased people, who don't support the uplifting of other cultures or other genders, well, then guess what they're doing? They're abiding by the very policy that you wrote. And if you want to change that, not only do you have to change them, but you actually have to change the very rule of law that you've written. And so when we talk about equity and we talk about equality, you know, my mind goes to say, how do we honestly do it right?
And one of the things that we also noticed, so when he has mentioned that equity to him is ownership, access to ownership, I think as an entrepreneur, that 100% makes sense. Also, if you don't like the rules, you make your own game, and I very much appreciate that about Miguel. But I think also if we're talking about language, and language matters, it does. So if we're talking about equity, to me, when he's saying ownership, he's talking about reparations. So that's what I hear in my mind. Taking that fence away, removing the fence altogether. Let's then talk about reparation. And over the course of the year, we'll get there, I hope.
Yeah.
But one of the things that we wanted to ask you all and ask you to consider, both within yourselves, again, being brave for yourself and with each other, is what would an equitable community look like to you? If you're talking about Southern Indiana, and we woke up tomorrow and Southern Indiana provided equitable services and equitable access, what does that look like? What does that mean? If the area that you have a sense of power over, if you hold leadership somewhere, if your organization was equitable tomorrow, what would have to change? So we want to give you a few minutes to consider that and to discuss that.
I love the fact that Missy asked this question. And Missy, I can't remember if you were on those calls or not, but so 3 years ago when COVID breaks out, right, Southern Indiana starts these conversations on Zoom, and more select people are on them, and it's not funny, but it's funny because in the process of it, there was nothing in these calls that leadership from this community was showing up on that was talking about the racial disparities. And so as we get into these rooms and we're having these discussions, now we're talking about the racial disparities. And I thought it was funny because somebody said we wouldn't have racism if COVID didn't happen in Southern Indiana. And I thought, wow, that's such a bold statement, but that also defines where we are, right? And so then there was this new committee that was formed to focus on the racial disparities that exist in Southern Indiana. And a handful of us sat in this room and we pontificated on the simplicities of racism. Yeah, I'm lying. So the thing is we went round and round in conversation about nothing, right? And I remember when this project ended and everybody got off these Zoom calls, and I had asked everybody the question in the room. You're all leaders. You're all owners of enterprise and industry. But we're sitting in a room talking about racial equity. What does it look like to you? And they all said, well, we don't know. We haven't thought that far in advance. And I thought, wow. Well, that's why we can't change anything, because it's not part of your everyday conversation. It's not part of your ongoing process. So when you're thinking about changing and building a community, the very people that you're saying, hey, we should help, ain't part of it. And so, yeah.
Well, there's also the conversation that I have a lot when we're talking about goal planning with families is if they can't see the end space, then they don't know how to even start moving there. They don't know the action steps that will move them there. So as a group, what we're encouraging everyone to do is envision the end space. If you can't see it, we can't move there. And your end space and your utopia, as you often say, will look different than someone else's. And I'm curious, I would have curiosity about that. Who is present in your end game and end space and who's not? So yeah, as a group, we would love for you all to have that conversation. What would an equitable Jeffersonville or Southern Indiana look like? And if we woke up tomorrow and equity was the name of the game.
Well, apparently you woke up today and equity is the name of the game because you're here. T and I did a discussion in Jasper. And there was definitely a person who absolutely opposed everything that we were discussing. And the question he asked, and I'm paraphrasing a bit, was, so it's not okay for me to love white people, so to speak, and to be white powered and white supremacist, yada, yada, yada. And the answer we answered him and said, yeah, it's okay. What's not okay is when you hurt other people because of your beliefs. We can all live in the same space and do the same thing. We don't have to hurt each other. We don't have to get in other people's way, right? We don't have to lose in order to gain.
One of the things that Miguel reminded me before we came down here is this project isn't about solving all of the problems, even though I would super love it to be about that. It's about, as a community, getting together and finding solution together. And again, we deeply believe the only way we're going to get there is start naming the problems and naming them in a public space, because that's where we're missing. This isn't polite. This isn't, if you were raised a polite white person, this isn't what you do. You don't sit up here and talk about this stuff. But I've forgotten how to be polite a long time ago. And that, I believe, is the only way that we are going to get to a solution. But again, we have to get there together. We live in a world that has an idea of what professionalism looks like when it comes to dress and language and hair. And if there are gatekeepers, as someone walks into a space, that you don't come across as that professional. And if someone has that unconscious bias, they're not racist. That person just didn't look professional. That voice isn't going to be heard in the space or in the room. That person won't be represented. And then we get into things like code switching. And are we even aware that we're asking so many people to present an alternative version of themselves so they have access? And if we don't have those conversations, then our rooms are going to be very homogenous in our spaces.
We're going to go back to what we were talking about before, while everybody was discussing, but I want to start with code switching, and then we're going to go back, right? Yeah. Because you say code switching, and it's a great term. But I wonder if most people even know what the hell code switching is. Like,
Valid.
You say code switching, like I think about code switching, and I think about some of my white counterparts, some of the boards that I sit on and some of the programs that I teach. If you said code switching, they'd look at you funny and be like, what do you mean Miguel code switches, right? He's like that all the time. right? So what is code switching?
Well, I'm going to ask you what you believe about it too, but code switching for me is when people have to wake up in the morning and think about where they're going. What space am I going to inhabit? Therefore, what clothes do I need to wear? Can I wear what I wear with this group of people, with this group of people? Do I have to change my hair? But more than anything, do I have to change the way I present in myself and my tone of voice and the words I use? And because I need to make the people who hold privilege, who have privilege, comfortable. I have a hairstyle that I can present as a professional in most spaces, but I have to be careful because in some spaces I can't. So I have to be aware of the way that my hair looks. But let's be real, that will never keep me from getting a job or holding space or being on a board, just because of an undercut. There are people who it will change their trajectory deeply, and they have much more at stake.
Got you. So I'm gonna be honest, I didn't really know what code switching was. I didn't have a term for it, right? So a little background. I have 2 degrees in business management. I have been studying management since I was in middle school, but I'm also a published photographer, videographer. I was first published in 6th grade, writing poetry, yada, 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 yippee, 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 right? So I have all these things that I am. I can speak 2 different types of English, and then a very European broken English, right? And I don't like wearing suits. But I was trained also not to wear suits. And I was trained that my talent and my gifts would be able to do whatever it is I wanted to navigate in this world. And that was taught to me by this white dude who, when I went to go work for Claire's, owned a company called Mr. Rags, and I got in his limo in my 3-piece suit, and everybody was in board sports and flip-flops, and he said, "Don't you ever get in my car dressed like that again." And I said, "Huh?" Because the suit is the uniform of the professional, right? And if I'm supposed to mimic this Anglo concept of equity and equality and financial vigor, I gotta dress that part. But he told me, "Miguel, no matter what you look like, you ain't gonna never be that part. You might as well dress like us, come on." Then I moved here. And I remember the first time I told somebody I had dual degrees and I'd made 6 figures by the time I was 25 years old and yada, 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 yada. And this dear person told me, he said, "Miguel, with all due respect, people here don't value educated people. You need to tell them that you don't have a master's degree. You need to tell them where you come from, just part of it. It's okay that it's okay that you've run the entire Northeast and had a $10 million budget and 150 employees. People here won't value that. They'll see you as a threat." And in that moment, I said, "Oh wow, I have to become something else in order to thrive here, where I was able to thrive everywhere else being that." That's code switching, and I didn't know that. And I learned how to do it, but I never had a phrase for it, right? And so it's, when do I turn on proper English? When do I turn on using the $12 and the $100 words versus the 4-letter words I'd prefer to use,
But also to that point, you are no less intelligent and you are still yourself, no matter how you come into a space. And that is something that we are not good, and that's not just Southern Indiana, anywhere,
yes,
of recognizing that we devalue someone, we make a quick judgment call on them based on that, ignoring the fact that there is an entire intelligent, whole human being that we are not getting to know because
Absolutely.
of those biases. And I think that one of the things that we also were talking about is the fact that we surround ourselves with people who look like us. And if you are someone who holds privilege in any space, and if you hold privilege and you surround yourself with people who hold that same privilege, then how are you ever going to do something different? And how are you ever going to move towards equitable space? And I'm thinking specifically of the boardroom.
Okay.
So if you have the opportunity to sit on a board and everyone looks like you, or everyone looks like the power brokers? How are you going to move towards an equitable space in your organization? If you are creating so for instance, we have space that we are trying to empower LGBTQ politicians, really people who are holding office. And if we don't have anyone who is LGBTQ at the table, what are we doing?
Well, how can you empower somebody that's not at the table? Like, how do you do work for someone? How do you say, I want to serve you, right? But I'm not going to get your opinion. I'm not going to get what values to you. And a lot of boards do that.
Can we talk about one of the things that you wrote on your cards that I glanced over and read?
Yes.
That equity is more than just bringing people to the table. And it's more than just hiring. It's more than just hiring diversity and people who have different voices. It's more than just bringing people into the space. Can you talk about that?
Because it's, equity, that's like, we get into this DE&I work and just these dumb little phrases like diversity, inclusion, and equity. And I think we say these things because it's fun. But the fact of the matter is that these are all action pieces. Just because you hired a bunch of black people doesn't mean you did a good thing. It just means you check the box. How many of them are actually advancing in your company? Are you offering the same level of training? Are you offering the same level of pay? Are you creating the same level of opportunities that you are for someone else? Are you prejudging the Latino or the black, brown, or the LGBTQ based on your bias, right? And sometimes based on your organization's bias. And I'll say this because I believe it was Fifth Third Bank, because they're based out of Cincinnati. Years ago, we were doing this study, and we were talking to a bunch of bankers that were trying to figure out why in this area, black folks weren't getting the opportunity to buy housing at the same level that their white counterparts were, or why business loans weren't going out. And it came back that there was this unwritten rule in Fifth Third. This is all banks, by the way. Is that if the application came in and the person's name was Shaniqua or Tyrone, that these applications immediately went to a trash, not a filing system. They don't exist. They have to be erased because we do not fund or support those type of people. You never met them, right? That happens in our institutions all over the time. And so I think that's a great example of, no, it's not about just going out and hiring people. It's literally looking at and saying, are we putting in and investing in them as we are everyone else, right? We don't just invite them to the company picnic. We invite them to our home picnic, right? Because we want to get to know them as a person, not a social security number that we fund. Right? It's a complex thing, but that's my brain, and that's where it goes when I think about these things. And our next conversation is about child abuse, right? Child abuse awareness and understanding the dynamics and the challenges that we face in childhood trauma. And that's going to happen at the Carnegie Museum, April 27th, same time. We have maybe 10 seats open left for that one, so if you would like to participate there, it's going to be really good. Missy's actually moderating it, and we have 3 other speakers that are going to come in and really share their wisdom and the things that they face in the organizations there. But the same standard, same setup, and the same feedback will be there. And then we're doing a Juneteenth event. So we will be doing a 3-day engagement starting June 15th. June 15th conversation is going to be specifically about how do we build black economic systems, black ecosystems, and what that means. And so we have Nikki Lanier, who is going to be on that discussion. I have 2 other people that I'm trying to see if we can get them in the state. So a buddy of mine named Dr. Malcolm Muhammad, who just left. He just finished his thesis with U of L, but he's now in Atlanta. So I'm trying to get him to come home because his whole thesis is about starting with young black folk at a young age and really teaching economics in a different way. And it's just amazing what he does. So if we can get him to come in, that's going to be awesome. And we'll have one other person there. And then Friday and Saturday, we are going to have a dedicated Juneteenth festival centered around Black history. I appreciate everybody. Missy, thank you. Everybody, I hope there's some takeaways. If there's anything we can do different, anything that we can add new to this process, please let us know. And yeah.
Thank you all so much for coming, and thank you, Miguel.
You're welcome. Let's get it. Let's go. Appreciate
Bye,
y'all.
friends.